Hello everyone, welcome to another arcade stick tutorial video. Today I am discussing a very important yet underutilized technique known as pad hacking. So what is pad hacking? This is the process of taking apart a pre-built off-the-counter controller like the one you see here and using the electronics inside of it to become the brains of your arcade stick. Why would you want to do this? Well, there could be a number of reasons. Like in this video, I am doing it because this pad here, the Sega Saturn pad by the Retrobit company, actually has the fastest Bluetooth response time on the Nintendo Switch. So if you want to play your Switch with an arcade stick, the internals of this controller, according to Shmup Junkie's testing in his recent video, check him out, check out his channel, subscribe, all that good stuff. Because of his testing, he found that this controller is actually faster than the Brooks wireless board. Another reason why it's useful is, of course, it is cheaper than buying the full-sized pre-made internals, right? So the Brooks wireless board is something like $80 to $90. This controller is $30. So you're saving yourself a good amount of time. And also, if you start buying broken controllers online, usually their internals are completely fine. You know, there's all the types of reasons why pad hacking can be very versatile outside of just this scenario, which I'll be using to create a wireless Bluetooth Nintendo Switch arcade stick that also connects to PC with good connections as well. So it's a really nice selection overall. But there could be other reasons, like you want to make a Neo Geo arcade stick, or you want to make a old Sega Saturn arcade stick. The Sega Genesis especially, because older, like the Brooks boards and stuff like that, don't seem to be able to connect to it. So if you want a Sega Genesis arcade stick and you don't want to buy one of those crappy old ones, you want a more modern one, a pad hack is usually the way to go. I've pad hacked many times, and so I'm happy to finally get around to making this tutorial video. So to warn you, this is a bit of an, I wouldn't say advanced, but intermediate level pad hack where the board itself actually isn't too bad and all that sort of thing, but you do need to be able to solder, you do need to be able to strip wires. I feel like these are just skills that, if you have any interest in arcade sticks or electronics, these are skills that you probably should have, especially if you want to get into console modding, all that sort of stuff. So if you're new to all this kind of thing, it might take a few tries to get a good pad hack going, but I'm going to try my best to guide you through this first process so that you don't make too many mistakes along the way. So let's look at the tools that you're going to need. Wire strippers, absolutely essential. Good wire, and when I say good wire, you don't want to get the wrong gauge of wire. You don't want to get wire that's hard to work with, or you don't want to get wire that's not very well insulated. So the kind of traditional wire that you can get is stuff from like Focus Attack for arcade stick wiring. You know, there's wiring for that specifically. But if you want to just grab something off the shelf or something around your house that works, high quality speaker wire also works fantastically. So speaker wire, if you don't have the, you know, special fight stick wire or whatever they use, speaker wire is definitely a good way to go. A small screwdriver just to open up the arcade stick. Soldering iron, absolutely essential. I recommend getting a little bit above the sort of really cheap, like $10 soldering irons. You know, if you can get up into the $50, $60 range even, that's usually a lot better. Just, you want an iron that's nice and hot, basically. So the ones that you buy for like $10, they probably could work for this particular pad hack. But you know, the nicer your soldering iron, usually the easier time you're gonna have. But you don't have to psych yourself out and spend hundreds of dollars on a nice soldering iron. I think a nice $50, $60 one, if you don't already own one, or if you're getting one just for this hack, you probably could use those cheap, you know, $10 ones that you get at the store or whatever. Flux, that's the stuff that you use that melts. You know, when you melt the piece of metal, that's called the flux. Scotch tape, this is recommended. You don't absolutely have to have it, but I would say get scotch tape. Electric tape for wrapping up the wires, and scissors for cutting stuff. And that's basically all the tools that you'll need, at least that I can remember. So here we go. So let's begin by taking this controller apart. And like I said, this controller is going to be a wireless Bluetooth controller that you can use on the Nintendo Switch, which makes it really cool. Also, I was going to feel a little bit guilty about using this controller, but back at this picture, the D-pad on it is not very good. They forgot to make sure it doesn't bottom out, and basically any controller D-pad that bottoms out is pretty trash in my opinion. You probably could modify it to fix that, but for the most part it doesn't matter because we're going to pad hack this baby anyway. So let's get it opened up inside. First thing you want to do is you want to disconnect the battery and disconnect the little rumble motors. I didn't use those, I just put those away. I guess you could technically have like rumble in your arcade stick, which might be kind of fun or annoying, but I went ahead and disconnected them. So definitely disconnect the battery first. So get that unconnected. And then I went ahead and disconnected those and took them out, set them aside. So far so good, nice and easy. Now we're going in and I'm just showing you, okay, take out the rumble motors. Now let's take out the board itself. I had to unscrew the board. It actually had little screws within the board. That's pretty cool that they did that. The build quality on this is fairly decent, other than the crazy D-pad setup here. There's like a screw in the bottom, it bottoms out, it's not good at all. But actually the silicone or whatever this inside and the board itself is very nice, and it's going to make the modification a lot easier. So let's look at what we're working with here. That's just me showing the crazy screw in the bottom of the D-pad. So let's look at what we got to work with here. So this is the target. What you're going to do when you do a pad hack is you're going to solder onto the contacts of the arcade stick board where you would normally press the buttons down. So this is where you have your up, down, left, and right, as you can see. And so the idea is that you replace the silicone button, let's go back, with your arcade stick button, right? Pretty simple in concept. The big thing you got to be mindful of is you see these lines between the contacts? You do not want to cross that with your solder, because otherwise you're going to have the button on all the time and it's going to be a nightmare. So, make sure when you're, and this will get trickier as we go, the D-pad's actually like the easy, nice way to get started, because it's really nice and easy to solder to. But yeah, you definitely do not want to cross that line there with your solders, because otherwise you're going to have a real fun time fixing that. And then let's look at what we got with the buttons. Buttons are not too bad, but you could see how it's not like a nice straight line, because it has this crazy weird curved cut. And the original Saturn pad has this as well. You're going to have to be much more precise with your soldering, but overall it's not too bad. It's not too bad. And then look up here, these shoulder buttons. So this is I've done pad hacks on original Saturn pads. This is always kind of a pain in the butt. Actually, on this pad, it wasn't too bad, because the flux and the contacts are really easy to solder to. So what you're going to solder to when you get to this part is you're going to solder to the left pin here and the right pin here. Try your best to avoid the bottom two and just do the top left and top right. Each time you solder to a contact, in case you don't know, one side is the ground and one side is the connection or whatever. And yeah, sometimes it takes a little bit of investigation, discovery to figure that out when you need to. But for the most part, since we're doing one-to-one connections, it really doesn't, you don't really need to know that. All you need to do is make sure you're not crossing them when you solder. So we'll get to that later. And then we got the home, select, and start button. So the home and select button, these were the ones that had me really nervous, because look, the way you need to solder it is you see these little joints right here on the left and right of each of these. You need to solder onto these little joints. And when I was first looking at this, I was like, oh, this is going to be hard. It actually was not too bad. The reason why is this board is very, very generous, has really nice contacts. So it just sucks up the solder or the flux really nicely. If you're just sure to get it nice and hot, it's actually not that hard to solder to, as long as you're being somewhat precise. So it looks scarier than it actually is, which is nice. So let's begin by stripping our wire. We got our wire stripper here. Got it. I placed it on like a bag when I do soldering. That's probably not the most official way to do it. Some people have their own little setups or whatever. But yeah, just have something to set it on that's not like your counter, so you don't burn your counter, but something. And then let's strip the wire. So when you strip the wire, you want to strip it like this. One end, which is sort of the end that you will connect to your wires of your arcade stick, you want a nice inch-long strip or something like that. Nice, give yourself lots of room there. And then this side right here is the part that you're going to place on the board. This one you have to be more precise. You don't want it too long, but you don't want it too short either. But you just want it a few millimeters. Basically, the shortest you can get away with it still being able to be placed on the board without the insulation getting in the way, right? So a few millimeters, and you'll see more examples as we get started. So let's get your soldering iron out. So the key is that you want your soldering iron turned up to full heat. If it has a heat dial or whatever, you want full power. You want as much heat coming off this bad boy as possible. Another hint that I want to give that I've learned sort of the hard way is I used to think when I was doing these pad hacks that I wanted to use a really small, precise head of my iron if your iron has different heads. But it turns out that the medium head is the best because you still need to put out a good amount of heat, and the smaller, precise ones just don't do that, and you're going to get yourself a lot of cold solders. Basically, the idea is you want a medium-sized head. That way you have precision, but you're able to still put a lot of heat out onto the board. And so let's get started here. This is just showing, okay, that's about the length of it, and that's how you place it. Let's start with the D-pad because it's definitely the easiest way to go. So first thing you do is you kind of place it, and then the next thing you want to do is you want to tape it down. That's why I put Scotch tape in the item list that you need. So the thing is that people would probably say, Scotch tape, what the hell? Shouldn't you use like electric tape or something like that? Well, I found that when you're placing down the wiring and wanting it to hold in place, because you need, your hands to solder, Scotch tape is actually better than electric tape for that. It just is stickier, it's more reliable. The electric tape can like get hot and start melting and be a mess, and Scotch tape doesn't do that. It just burns, which is actually convenient. So I recommend using Scotch tape to place the wiring. That's why I put it on the list. So you get that placed. Oh yeah, you get it nice and hot. So before you apply the soldering iron and the flux, just set that iron on the wire and on the contact for, I don't know, 30 seconds or something like that. You don't want to place it on there so long that you burn the contact, but you want to get it really hot. So place it on there a good amount of time, and then you want to just come in real fast with the solder, and you want to, I recommend kind of like putting the flux down the side of your barrel, getting it nice and hot, and then you kind of just slide it onto the wire, and then use the head of your soldering iron to sort of guide it over the contact. You want everything to be hot, and you want everything to look nice and silvery when it connects. If it looks kind of dirty and muddled, and it looks kind of like a nickel or something like that, that is a cold solder. You want a nice hot solder, and you can tell you want it to be liquid when it hits that contact and it's over it, and it makes a nice strong weld. So there you go. That's an example. It's a little bit blurry. That's an example of a nice solder. We'll see plenty more. Then we just go to the next one. See how I'm being very careful not to cross that line. I think I was a little closer than I wanted to be. So to adjust, I moved this wire back a little bit. And there you go. That's a very nice... I'm not like a master level soldering person or anything like that, but I do tend to be able to get some pretty strong connections. So then there's that one. And then once you get those done, remove the tape. Move on to the next. Here we go. Next one. Get it nice and hot. Solder it down. Oh, very important hint. Have the wires be facing outward from the board. Don't cross the board. So don't bring the wire up from the top here and solder to the bottom. You want the wire to be facing outward from the contact as much as possible, because otherwise you're going to get wires in the way as you go. So here we go. Keep it going. Okay. So there's me all done. I got all the contacts. Not too bad. That's 8 solders. Depending on how good you are at soldering, this could take a while. It took me about 3 hours of soldering to get it all done. Again, if you're just trying to buy your way out of this, I'm sure, buying a Brooks Ultimate board is more convenient. But if you're trying to, if you're into hobbyist type pad hacking projects, this is cost effective. And I actually find it pretty fun and relaxing. It's like the manly version of being geeky, right? Soldering. So here we go. Now we're going to get into the more complicated solder here on the buttons. So the technique that I do on these buttons is you're definitely wanting to aim at the fattest part of the contact here. And actually what I found was really effective was you sort of tape down your wire a little bit back so that it's barely touching that contact. And then you bring the solder over the wire and you let the solder just flow onto the contact from the wire, making sure everything's nice and hot. But you you start from the back of the wire and you just push that solder onto the contact. Just like that one's pretty ugly, but it worked. I have a really good one to think later on. This one looks a little bit better. You come in. Again, these ones you have to be very careful not to cross this line. And if you do, what you should do is you should just get your soldering iron and rub it over the contact to, scrape off the flux. You have to do that. And then you can get some rubbing alcohol and a sponge or something like that and kind of brush it and re-clean it, get it nice and clean. The unfortunate thing, or kind of the way soldering works, is usually the best time is the first time, right? When the contact's nice and clean and you're not destroying it too much. The more you kind of fiddle around with it and burn it with your soldering iron, the harder it gets to make the solder work, but sometimes that happens. So far, 3 solid solders. I would say, just to make sure that the solder is good, is after you take off the tape, you don't have to be forceful, but kind of just wiggle it a little bit and make sure that it's connected to that board and you don't have a cold solder, especially on these contacts since they're so small. So then we keep it going. Then I get the bottom here. See that solder went a little bit funky. I ended up having to scrape it a bit. This one right here, this red one, that's what we want to see. It's like perfect. How it just melted into that perfectly. That's what I like. These other ones are pretty decent. I actually only had to redo this one because I went a little crazy right here. You can see it's kind of crossing over a bit. I had to scrape it and redo it, but other than that, everything else was good. So here we go. Now we're going to come up onto these pins. And again, this actually worked out really well. What I ended up doing, this is on the R and L buttons here, is you just get it nice and hot, then you sit the wire right down on it, and then just melt the flux over it. It actually was a really easy solder. It looks a lot harder than it actually is. It was actually super easy. So I was relieved by that, and they go on real nicely. The other side, got that done. And now I'm showing, we've got the start select done. Now we're showing the home and the select button. Those were the tricky ones. But if you come in and you just hold it nice and in place, and then just basically you shove the wire into the side of it, and then you just melt the solder over it, or the flux over it, keeping everything nice and hot. It went pretty well. I didn't have to redo them, and they worked. So that's great. So then once you get all the wires soldered on there, that took me a few hours. Then you can connect it up, and then just if you take the 2 ends of the wires and touch them together, it's like you're pressing the button. So just do that. I did that with the home button. If you do it for 3 seconds, it'll turn on the controller. It's like, oh, okay, the home button worked. This is a way you can test it to see if the controller's working. You can just plug it into your computer. If you're not sure if a connection works, you just touch the 2 wires together, and there you go. So then this is showing me that exact process. I'm touching the 2 wires together, and I'm getting a right input. These belong to the right. So go ahead and do that. And then once you make sure all the connections work, so you go one by one, testing them. It's actually easier if you test it on a computer rather than on the Switch, because the Switch is a little more sensitive about, when positives touch and stuff like that, where computers can take it a little better. So once you make sure every single solder is working correctly, then you take out your hot glue gun and you just hot glue the crap over the top of all the contacts. This serves 2 good purposes. The first is it just holds it in place much better, so you're much more likely to, it's not going to come apart on you if you just get a nice hot glue over all the solders. The other thing that's really important is that it insulates them, so that you're not getting cross contact, and stuff like that. Inside your arcade stick, something touches it and activates an input. It's a really fast and easy way to insulate all your solders, and I absolutely recommend it. So once you get that, it looks like you have a crazy mutant squid or something. It looks crazy, but it's working well. So the next step, after you see, this is just a zoom in on the glue. Yes, the hot glue is holding nice in place. Is turning your attention to your arcade stick itself. Sorry. So here we go. We're looking inside my arcade stick. All the insides of my arcade sticks look crazy because I mod them all the time. You can see over here there's hot glue. This is the holder for my old Brooks board. I moved my Brooks board out of this, but I left this in here in case I want to move it back in there. So, but ignore that. That's not important. So what we need to do now is you just go ahead and you snip the wires of your buttons. Do not snip them too close. You want a good amount, you know, the longer the better, really. But you don't want to also snip it too close to the other board, because then it's really hard to reuse them. So a nice middle type snip is just fine. One note that's very important is that this process is going to be much easier if you have a Korean stick or you have a Seimitsu stick. And the reason for that, as you can see the contacts here, is that the Korean and Seimitsu sticks have 2 contact points that are very easy to access. This is actually already done. I didn't have to do this on your arcade sticks. But if you have a JLF, you're going to have to, it's not that hard, but you're going to have to open it up and get inside there and manually get to those contacts underneath the gate and stuff like that. You cannot use that sort of like pre-made little connector thing. And the reason for that, it's stupid, but the reason for that is I found that the switch in this controller that I'm pad hacking is really sensitive to sharing grounds. It doesn't want to do it. If you do that, it starts making the inputs go crazy and stuff like that. It wants each input to have its own ground, which it does on the controller, which it does on your buttons. See, so on your buttons, it doesn't matter which is which, but you have a ground and a connector, ground and a connector. Again, it doesn't matter which one is which on the button. Just make sure they are lining up, you know. And same thing with the left, right, and usually what I would do with some Padhacks is I would take all the grounds, combine them together, and then combine them with all the grounds on the controller just for cleanliness. But it turns out with this Padhack and probably more Padhacks is controllers are a little bit more sensitive to sharing grounds than like a Brooks board or something like that. So just make sure to separate all the grounds out nice and cleanly. And that may involve you opening up your JLF. And you see here, you could solder the wires to the contacts here. I didn't. I just hot glued them because in case I want to take them off at some point, you know, if you solder them, taking them off is basically impossible or a real nightmare. But if you hot glue them, wrap and hot glue, it's like that. Either works, either works. So here we go. Then what you're gonna do is you're gonna take the wires like you see here. So these 2 are from my arcade stick, these 2 are from the board, and then you just braid them together like so. Braid each one, the positive, positive, negative to negative. And then you wrap those braids, like you can see here, in electric tape. So now you have a nice insulated connection. This process is not that hard. It's just a little bit time consuming because you have to strip all these wires and everything. But just keep it rolling. This is just showing how funky it looks while you're in middle of it. Just keep it going. Keep it going. And then once you're all done, you can be neat and try and like make your wires look all nice, or you can just put this squid inside your arcade stick, turn on the home button to make sure it works. Yes, it works, and close it. Right? I actually put a little. What I sometimes do is I put a little bit of a like cloth over the top of it, just so that the metal of my arcade stick is not touching it. I have a metal bottom arcade stick, which isn't that advisable. Some are plastic bottom, mine are metal bottom. If you have a metal bottom one, I always recommend putting a cloth or some kind of insulation, because otherwise you may get the metal on metal causing funkiness with your arcade PCBs and stuff like that, or the Padhack here. Then here we go, and I did the test, and yes, they are appearing. It is working. I now have a Bluetooth wireless arcade stick for the Nintendo Switch. It also works on the PC. It's super responsive. I absolutely recommend it. I'll put a link to it in the video description, this exact one. Only $30 compared to the Brooks $90 board. Very, very nice. The Brooks board is better in that it can connect to the PS4 and all those good stuff. But this thing can connect to PC really well. It also connects to the Switch. And yeah, a great alternative. And it's super responsive. More responsive, at least on the Switch, than the Brooks board is, according to Shmup Masters test, which is really cool. And again, check out his video. I'll put a card for it again. But yes, absolutely. I'm really excited for it. And if you want low latency gameplay on your Switch, but also again, you can use this technique across many things. You cannot use this for certain controllers though. You need kind of retro-ish type controllers with those contacts. Like you can't do this, well, I guess if you're a master, you probably could figure out a way, but stuff like the PS4 controller, the PS3 controller, even the PS2 controller, not really. You needed one with those like metal contacts on the board. So the Saturn, the N64, the Genesis, the Neo Geo, all that sort of stuff. And a lot of third-party controllers like the one I'm showing here. And since you made it to the end of the video, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribed and got your notifications, all that good stuff. So yes, let me thank my patrons. So thank you to Dingo, Andy Capt, Anthony A, Ben Wynn, Corio, Eric H, Full Set, Retro Schmupper, Howsu, Kiwi, JB, RPG, Joe Angelo, Gameboy Guru, K, Malays, Mark Toms, Martin Worrell, Maz, Mayor Calendrian, Queen Charlene, Nathaniel Davis, and Electron, Okla Kugels, Raul, Smacky Factor, Sugumo, Plasmo, and Utakaya. Thanks for watching.